Many of us have had dreams pertaining to death, but how do you know if the dream is literal or symbolic? I'm going to talk about what death could mean in dreams. Abraham Lincoln was a dreamer. It was said that he had a dream that he was walking through the White House one night and he went into the East Room where he saw a body lying in state. He asked one of the guards, "Who died?" And the guard said, "Why, haven't you heard? The president was assassinated." And he woke up. Also, it was said that Lincoln had recurring dreams. He often said that he would dream that he was in a boat and he was sailing across an unknown body of water at a very rapid pace to a faraway land. But how do you know if a dream pertaining to death is literal or symbolic? Most of the time, if the dream is literal, meaning that the person you see in the dream as dead, being dead, is literal, meaning the person is literally going to die, it will not be a scenario of you being at their funeral or you seeing them in a coffin. Usually, if it's talking about literal death, it will be some other type of scenario. I'll give you an example. When my mother was very, very sick, and she was sick for many years with a heart condition, I had a dream one night that she and I was sitting in church. All of a sudden, she stood up, and when she stood up, she looked so young and so beautiful. She looked like she was in her 20s, and at that time, she was in her late 50s. And she had on a black dress and a black hat, and she turned and she looked at me, and she had the brightest smile, and she waved goodbye. And she turned and she walked out of the church. When I woke up, I knew God was preparing me for her death. So it was a scenario of being in church with her and her actually leaving the church. It wasn't a scene where I was at her funeral or looking at her in a coffin. So usually, if it's speaking of literal death, it will be another kind or a different kind of scenario other than straightforward, you're at the funeral or someone comes and tells you that so-and-so is dead or so-and-so died. It's going to be some other scenario. I'll give you another example. Someone I know had a close relative who was suffering from a terminal illness, and this person was in pain, constant pain. And so as death was approaching, he had a dream that he saw this loved one in a field of beautiful flowers, and she was enjoying herself, and she was at so much peace, and he woke up. And after he woke up, he felt in the dream, from the dream, because she was just so full of joy, that she would be cured or healed, and she would do better, when in fact, about a week later, she died. So, literal dreams of death will have a different scenario. It won't speak of death in the scenario. It'll speak of something else or have some other scene. But yet, God is preparing you for that loved one's death. So, what could be some symbolic meanings of death? Let's look at that. Symbolically, death in a dream could represent a spiritual death. Someone who's dead in sin, who hasn't accepted Christ in their life as their Savior. It could be speaking of that. It could also be speaking of death to self, someone dying to themselves, to their own selfish desires and their own selfish needs. So yes, a dream of death can be a good dream. It just depends on the context of the dream. Also, a death dream or dream of death can be speaking of an end of a relationship. For instance, If you have a dream that your friend suddenly dies in the dream, it could be speaking of that relationship coming to an end or has come to an end as well. Death in a dream can also represent the death of a ministry. It could mean the death of a vocation, of a dream even, or of a hope. I once had a dream many years ago that I was counting the coffins that I owned. Yes, coffins in the dream. And so I owned so many different coffins. And in the dream, each coffin had their own individual beautiful color. And it was as if I was taking inventory of what I had in my possession. And so when I woke up from the dream, God gave me the interpretation of the dream, and he was showing me that I had put to rest so many gifts and talents that he had placed on the inside of me, and he wanted me to bring them to life. Also, death in a dream can represent separation from something or severing of something in your life. For instance, if you have a dream that your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend or your ex-spouse died, that could be representative of you separating from past issues or some negative issue from the past. Also, you can have a dream where someone close to you dies, and in reality, a short time later, someone else close to you dies. For instance, you can have a dream, and many people have had this to happen. You can have a dream that your brother dies, and then a week later, your cousin dies. And so the dream was just showing that someone close to you was going to die. If you dream you're in a cemetery, that could mean that you're in a dead place. You're in a place with no life. You're not in a good place in your life, and you feel like everything around you is dying. You could have a dream where you're actually standing in a cemetery, because it represents a place of no life at all, only dead things. So cemeteries can also represent natural death as well, but in dreams, a lot of times they tend to represent spiritual death or something symbolic of death. Cemeteries can also represent the end of something, coming to the end of something in your life, the end of your career, or the end of a relationship, or the end of something is taking place in your life. Or, as I mentioned earlier about my coffin dream, where you're putting something to rest, or you're doing away with something, you're burying it once and for all. So can a dream about death be literal and have a funeral scenario? Absolutely. Absolutely. This does not always mean that. So there are no pat rules. There are no pat answers when it comes to interpreting dreams. So as I mentioned earlier about the dream of Abraham Lincoln, where he actually saw himself lying in state in the East Room, and a few days later he was actually assassinated. So yes, you can absolutely have a dream that's literally talking about death and have a funeral scenario. But most of the time, if someone is actually going to die in a dream, you will not have a funeral scenario. It will be some other type of scenario in the dream. And I believe God gives us other types of scenarios to gently warn us that our loved one is going to depart, as opposed to putting the dream in a funeral type scenario, because God is just so loving and gentle like that. Well, I hope you found this video informative. If you have any comments or questions about dreams, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. And don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.